Okay, I am going to try something a little bit different here. I am not feeling well. I don't feel like scripting an entire video. I don't have time to prepare elaborate slides, and I am behind on almost everything that I'm trying to do. But I got a couple of responses to a post that I made on Facebook, just sort of a throwaway post, but the response that I got was a little interesting, so I'm going to read it, and then I will respond to it here, based on written notes and just sort of off the cuff. So my post was, quote, debunked, that is, the word debunked, may be the king of the weasel words. And a respondent says, my vote goes towards faith as king of the weasel words. And then he follows up with, quote, I call faith a weasel word, the ultimate one, because when someone tells you you have an unjustified, untrue belief, they can simply say, well, I have faith. And faith means I have no rational grounds for believing this. I should also note that Descartes' Meditations was one of my first philosophy books. Throw out everything you can't be 100% sure of, end quote. As I say, I don't have a lot of time, and what that actually translates to, believe it or not, is probably a longer video than I would be able to create if I had more time. I'm very fond of the quote from Blaise Pascal, something along the lines of, I'm sorry I made this letter so long, but I didn't have time to make it shorter. The editing process is usually what takes the longest time in some productions, and I certainly find that to be the case myself. Okay, so a couple of the complaints that I have about the comments. The first is the form, and actually a couple of these initial ones are going to be maybe less significant from a philosophical standpoint, but nevertheless, out of completeness, I'm just going to enumerate them. The first thing is I'm a little unclear as to the argument. He seems to be saying that if something, X, can be used to stop an argument, then that thing is a weasel word. So in other words, if X is an argument stopper, then X is a weasel word. And I'm not really, that's not the use of the word that I am thinking of. I mean, there's a lot of things that could be used to stop an argument. I mean, I could say that's none of your business, or I could say piss off, or I could say any number of things. All of those would be argument stoppers, but I don't think that they're weasel words. So I'm thinking of weasel word in essentially Wikipedia sense, if you like. I mean, Wikipedia, if you read entries for any length of time, you'll almost certainly see a little superscript that's supposed to direct you to a commentary page. And oftentimes it'll say something like weasel word. I'm pretty sure it says that, although I'm too lazy to look it up right now. So in this case, the definition you can just get by Googling it. And here's what I got when I Googled it. A weasel word is, quote, a word used to evade making a direct statement about something. You're trying to avoid having to make some kind of a direct statement. You're trying to avoid coming down clearly on an issue, making a definable, definite statement about something. Well, in that sense, an appeal to faith doesn't seem to qualify at all. I mean, an appeal to faith, this commenter might not like an appeal to faith, but it's certainly the case that it's a direct statement. I mean, it seems to be very clearly making a statement, even in the commenter sets, which we'll get to in a minute, in terms of whether that's a fair assessment of what faith is. I don't think it is. But nevertheless, it's clear. I mean, there's nothing weaselly about it in that sense. It's not evasive. I mean, one of the paradigmatic weasel words that you'll see if you list out what are some of these, there are things like, the phrase "some say," so some say. I mean, in Wikipedia, again, in these superscripted comments, sometimes you'll see who says, right? Some say Abraham Lincoln was assassinated because of money issues. Who? It's a weasel word because you don't actually say who. If you were to cite who says this, then you could make a determination as to the quality of the source or as to the caliber of the person's arguments and so on. Now, an appeal to faith might evade argument, at least if we grant, just for provisional purposes, just for the time being, if I grant that faith is an appeal that is opposite making an argument. In other words, you've got a rational appeal and then you've got a faith-based appeal. And this is the way that the commenter seems to be using the word. Once again, I'm going to object to that use of the word, or at least qualify it in a minute. But if you think of it that way, then you might say, okay, faith does stop argument. But the question of the Weasel word is that it evades making a direct statement. So the problem with some say is that it's not specific. It's not direct. But faith is just objectionable to a person who is anti-faith. The idea of an appeal to faith is just objectionable, but that doesn't mean that it isn't direct. And that's the issue with the Weasel word. And I'm saying this applies to debunked, by the way, because this is exactly the way that word is used. If you see it in context, it's often such and such is a conspiracy theory that's been debunked. Well, beside the phrase conspiracy theory, which is problematic on its own, you also have the idea that what does it mean to be debunked? What is the bunk that's been taken out? To debunk something is to take the bunk out, but it's not uncontroversial what the bunk is. There isn't one thing that's bunk that's put into theories. It's not just that there's bunk in it, like you can have a, you could have a fireplace that's full of soot, and to de-soot your fireplace would be to get the soot out. Anyway. Now, the second complaint on the form of it is that it has to do with the allegation. So the allegation is you have an unjustified, untrue belief. This is what the commenter says. Essentially, all this charge amounts to is you're wrong. To say you have an unjustified, untrue belief is simply to say you're wrong. And it's an assertion. And I choose my word very carefully there. An assertion is something you simply lay out. You simply lay it down. There is no argument provided with an assertion. And in the post, that's exactly what you find. It's simply the assertion that your belief is unjustified, whatever the belief is, and that it's untrue. Bad enough to be unjustified, but untrue as well? My gosh, what does that mean? It means that you're just completely wrong. But there's no argument there. There's no argument that you're either unjustified or that the belief is untrue. It's simply asserted. Well, what is your rational obligation in the face of an assertion? And the answer is a counter-assertion, at best. You could simply ignore it. An assertion is nothing in terms of argument. It has no weight whatsoever in terms of epistemic duty, rational obligations. You could assume rational obligations. You could assume the burden of proof if you like, but you're under no obligation to. If somebody just says, you're wrong, what are your obligations? Nothing. You just say, okay. So the problem is, this whole thing is weaselly. By the same standard, the whole thing he's saying is weaselly. Your belief is unjustified and untrue itself is weaselly in the very same sense. There's no specificity. There's no argumentation. Now, if you look at the language of this, it says unjustified, untrue belief. So this phraseology essentially telegraphs this as a sort of assumed, justified, true belief theory of knowledge. I'm going to abbreviate that JTB as a standard. It's the JTB theory of knowledge, justified true belief. Now, this is a popular theory. There's no question. It's not the only theory of knowledge. There are many theories. In fact, there are many theories that have theories have ramified after something called a Gettier case was discovered by a guy named Gettier. And these Gettier cases are essentially cases that make trouble for the justified true belief view. Well, let's, at least preliminarily, let's just give a sketch of what that is. So the question is, what constitutes knowledge? What does knowledge consist in? And one answer that's been given, and it's traced back to Plato, is this idea of justified true belief. If you want to know what is knowledge, it's having a justified true belief. So just really quickly, there are three conditions that apply to knowledge on this view. The first is the psychological condition, or the doxastic condition, the belief condition. You have to believe it. In other words, you can't have knowledge of something if you don't have the requisite belief in something. Or to put it another way, Joe cannot know that grass is green if Joe doesn't even believe that grass is green. Joe has to believe that grass is green in order to know it. Now, the fact that he believes it doesn't automatically mean that he knows it, because there are two other conditions on this theory. So the first one, just taking them in no particular order, is the justification condition. This is also called the epistemic condition, and it's essentially the one that says, what does it take for a belief to graduate to knowledge? One of the things that it takes on this view is justification. We'll get into what that means in just a moment. Now, the third condition is the metaphysical condition, the truth condition. This is to say that the belief has to actually be true in order for it to be knowledge. So even if Joe believes, let's say, that grass is black, and let's say he has some reason for it, granting that doesn't follow that he knows it, because in fact, let's stipulate, grass is green, not black. So if Joe believes that grass is black, even if he's got some reason for that, fill in the blank with a pretend reason, he still can't know it. It doesn't graduate to knowledge because it fails the metaphysical condition. So the Gettier cases were cases where a person seemed to have all three of the things. The justification condition was met, the truth condition was met, and the belief condition was met, and yet these Gettier cases are supposedly cases in which all three of those conditions are met, and yet our intuitions are that the person in question still doesn't have knowledge for some other reason. I don't want to get into those cases now because they're just beside the point, but that would be another view of knowledge. How do you respond to the Gettier cases? And there's all kinds of other spin-offs to the JTB theory. Some people replace justification with warrant. Some people take the JTB basic scaffold and add a fourth condition to it, some anti-Gettier condition. Some scrap it all together. And by the way, there are pragmatic theories of knowledge that take a completely different tack as to what knowledge is. So there's all kinds of different theories. The JTB theory is one, and what I'm pointing out is that the questioner assumes it without argument. The questioner assumes the JTB theory of knowledge without arguing for the JTB theory. Now, just to punctuate the perplexity that I have here is that not only are there different views of knowledge, but there's different views of each of the different conditions. So taking, say, the justification condition, there are different views as to what constitutes justification. Two main camps in that debate are going to be the internalist camp and the externalist camp. If you're an internalist, then basically you think that justification is what you might colloquially call a reason. And the key distinguishing feature of a reason is that it's accessible to the knower or the prospective knower. So in other words, to an internalist, it's not enough to have justification. You have to have internal access to it. And that's typically some kind of a cognitive thing. That's some kind of a reason that you would have. In other words, if I asked you, what is your justification for believing that grass is green or grass is black or any number of other propositions that I could ask questions about, the answer you give me is going to be your reason to a first approximation, and that then can be assessed, and your having access to that would satisfy in principle the internalist requirements for justification. On the other hand, an externalist says it's not that way at all. And one common way of unpacking an externalist theory of justification would be that your belief is simply the product of a reliable belief-making process. You don't even have to have any knowledge of that process at all. Simply, if your belief arises as the result of a reliable belief-making process, then the belief is justified. And if I asked you about the belief, you may have no answer. But it doesn't matter, because if you're an externalist about justification, the justification consists in the process, whether or not you have any knowledge of it. In fact, you don't have to have. Now, why am I pointing that out? Well, I'm pointing that out because the questioner not only assumes the JTB theory of knowledge, but also seems to take an internalist posture with respect to justification. And once again, there's no argument for the JTB theory. There's no argument there for internalism. Just to punctuate this a little more, a person could be an externalist and still accept the JTB theory, and what they give in terms of answers would look a lot like faith to the complaining commenter, but would be nothing of the kind. It would simply be an externalist picture of justification. And by the way, there are a number of thinkers, not all of them are Christian, but one of them is Alvin Plantinga, who has developed, at least provisionally, an externalist view of justification. And it doesn't follow for 1 second that he's simply opting out of rational requirements with respect to the thing that the questioner seems to be complaining about, namely that faith leaves a person off the hook, say, for their rational obligations. Plantinga is a Christian who has developed an externalist picture of what justification consists in, and the commenter might not like it, but that's neither here nor there. It doesn't follow that it's simply irrational because it's not favored by the commenter. And it would be, my point is, from everything that's been said in the comment, it would be very difficult to distinguish an appeal to faith from a externalist picture of justification, even though a person who has an externalist picture could perfectly well accept the JTB theory that the questioner seems to accept as well. Okay, now, another thing that I'd like to just briefly comment on is the question of who actually is in view. I mean, if you think about what's being said there is your belief is totally, not just in the comment, it basically says, well, your belief is unjustified and untrue. Now, who, pray tell, is saying, you know what, I accept the criticism that my belief is both unjustified and untrue. In other words, I'm granting you that my belief is false, but I'm going to appeal to faith and say I'm going to believe it anyway. I mean, who is saying, yes, I admit my beliefs are false, but I'm going to continue to believe my false beliefs and justify them somehow in an appeal to faith? Like who? Who is saying this? I mean, this is just completely made up. I've never heard anybody speaking this way. It is completely uncharitable. I mean, if you want to, and the problem is, though, it doesn't work if you leave one of those words out. I mean, for example, if you just say your belief is unjustified, it doesn't follow that it's untrue. And the objector here obviously knows that because he put in untrue. It does pull actual weight in the comment. You can't leave it out because if something is simply unjustified, you could simply shrug your shoulders and say, so what? Doesn't mean it's not true. And similarly, if somebody just said, oh, your belief is untrue, well, that's nice, but that falls back to the problem of it simply being an assertion. You have to do more than that to say something is untrue. You have to actually argue for the untruth of the belief. And again, the commenter has done nothing. No argument for JTB, no argument for internalism, no argument that the belief in question, which is obviously just hypothetical, is untrue. No reason to think there's anybody who would say, I accept the criticism that my belief is false, but I'm going to tell you I believe it anyway because faith. That completely made up. Well, it's disappointing to me because it's just so uncharitable. I mean, I have no problem with attempting to think through hard issues, but when somebody is saying, well, here's my problem with faith, is that people who are told and admit that their beliefs are false, and they admit that, and they accept that they're false, they nevertheless continue to believe them anyway because of faith. Who? I mean, there again, if you want to talk weasel word, the weasel word would be simply assuming that there are any such people. Like the some say. Some people say, in the face of the charge that their beliefs are unjustified and false, that they simply are going to appeal to faith. Who? Now, thirdly, it's quite interesting to me that Descartes is brought up in this example. And the commenter says, toss out anything not 100% certain. I've had interactions with the commenter before, and I can tell you, without getting specific, that numerous beliefs, say about meteorology or climatology, that the commenter holds would not pass a Cartesian test of 100% certainty. They're not 100% certainty. And I would say that it would display bad faith on the part of the commenter to say that they do. It's clear that they don't by any Cartesian standard. Now, again, you don't have to be a Cartesian, but that's what he says in the comment. He says, I first read Descartes, and it has some sentimental appeal, and according to Descartes, toss anything out that's not 100% certain. Well, then we would toss out beliefs about meteorology or climatology. They're certainly not 100% certain. What was Descartes' standard for a belief that could pass that test? It would have to be intuitively clear and obvious. And these beliefs certainly wouldn't be that. These beliefs are very empirical, They certainly don't rest on intuitively obvious foundations, and therefore on Cartesian premises we'd toss them out. But the fact is, I know that the commenter has certainly not applied that standard to other areas of knowledge. And so it's a bit disingenuous, I think, for him to trot that out when it comes to religion. It's like a cab that you simply dismiss when you've got to your destination. Well, I want to be a Cartesian to get rid of religion, and then I'll switch to something else and I'll advocate other beliefs on a different basis. But the second thing that's interesting about this appeal to or mention of Descartes is the fact that the JTB theory, justified true belief, says nothing about certainty, let alone 100% certainty or anything of the kind. It's simply not there. It would be like saying that a peanut butter and jelly sandwich has to have bananas. I mean, no, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich only has to have peanut butter, jelly, and bread to be a sandwich. I mean, that's the basic ingredients. Bananas you could add, but it's not part of the basic ingredient list. So if you ask the question, what does it take on the JTB theory to constitute knowledge? It takes J, it takes T, it takes B. 3 ingredients: justification, truth, and belief. That's it. There's no certainty there. In other words, it would be perfectly possible for a person to believe something for a good reason and to have that belief be true and for it to count as knowledge and to have the person nowhere near 100% certainty. The person does not have to know that they know, which would be second-order knowledge. There's no requirement for second-order knowledge. There's no requirement for certainty. It's simply not there. Now, if you want to add certainty as a requirement, then certainly, no pun intended, it seems like Descartes did. I'm not arguing that Descartes himself didn't consider certainty to be sort of the gold standard for knowledge. But that's not the JTB theory. That is a different theory of knowledge. And if you want to try to combine them, maybe you'd say, well, then the Cartesian version would be JTBC, the fourth condition being certainty. And we'd have to work that in somehow. And the final main point here is the complexity of the relationship of faith and reason. And once again, the commenter says nothing about this. But it's every bit as complex as any of the other issues that we've been discussing. You know, the JTB theory, as we said, is only one of several views of knowledge. The perspective of internalism is only one of several perspectives on what constitutes justification. And similarly, this idea of there being an antagonism between faith and reason is only one of several views as to how faith and reason relate to one another. Now this I will put up on the screen, and I really like, there's a book of philosophy from an introductory text on philosophy from the authors Honer, Hunt, and Ockholm. And this is, I don't have it here, but it's called Invitation to Philosophy, I think. And it has a number of really helpful diagrams that show you how certain positions kind of relate to one another. I do have problems with it in terms of things that I object to, but this is not a video about that. And in this case, their diagram on the relationship of faith and reason is, it's simple, but it's quite illustrative, it's quite instructive. And it indicates that the antagonistic position where faith and reason are incompatible is on one side of a continuum. On the other side, they have, I think, faith and reason converging. That is to say that there are people who hold that both faith and reason can get you to the same place, so to speak. That any truth that's knowable through reason is also knowable through faith, and vice versa. That's convergence. And it seems like Emanuel Swedenborg is one of these people who held to a view similar to that. Now, my intention is not to endorse Swedenborg or endorse that position. It's simply to say that it by no means follows that a person who uses the word faith takes the perspective that the commenter does, that faith means irrationalism or that it means some kind of an antagonism with reason. That is simply one perspective that, not to sound like a broken record, that the commenter does not argue for. No argument for JTB, no argument for internalism, no argument, in fact, that there's any antagonism between faith and reason. And just to round things out, the center position is that faith and reason are complementary. That is to say that certain truths can be known by faith, certain truths can be known by reason, but the complementary idea is going to be to say that there's not going to be any truth you can find in reason that would be contradicted by a truth of faith. They're going to be complementary. One might take you further, but they're not going to be at odds. One example of this, just for illustration purposes, was Thomas Aquinas, who held that reason could demonstrate that God existed. So Aquinas thought that that reason could get you to the truth that there was a God, but he thought that it could not get you to the truth that God was a Trinity. He thought that was only demonstrable through revelation, and the resources of faith would be general and special revelation, and that's what he believed. But there's no incompatibility there. I mean, God existing is perfectly compatible with God being a Trinity. It's simply that that faith, according to Aquinas, was not available. Neoplatonism, on the other hand, people who are partial to Neoplatonism, I think, very frequently hold that the multiplicity of the Godhead can be established through reason. So again, this is an open question in the history of philosophy, anyway. Okay, just a few little tidbits. One that I have is a first book is like a first love. I don't remember where I read that. Somebody likened a first book to a first love. It might have been John Searle. I can't remember. But the mention of Descartes being the first book of philosophy is, in my mind, that connects up with this idea of the first book being like a first love. I'm just throwing it out. It's kind of an interesting thing that you might have more sentimental attachment to the first book that you read. Maybe there's no rational reason for it, but it was just the first one you fell in love with. Justification and truth come apart. I think we've touched on that. Just because you have a justified belief doesn't mean that it's true. I mean, an obvious example of that, according to standard assumptions, would be the appearance. If you go outside and look at the Earth, it mostly looks flat. So it would be not unjustified to think that the Earth itself is flat. And yet, the received view, of course, is that it's a sphere or spheroidal. And yet, it would not be unjustified to think that it's flat. So here you have a justified belief that nevertheless is false. So that means justification is not indefeasible. That means that have justification doesn't mean that there's no further consideration that could undercut the belief that you have and the evidence that you have for it. Indefeasibility is an important aspect of this question. It basically means that you're not infallible, that evidence you have is not incorrigible. So all of these words are very important, and we could go into them in further videos. Finally, penultimately maybe, there is a quote which I'll try and dig up that bears on some of these questions about what it means to hold to something religiously. For instance, that some beliefs that appear to be scientific can nevertheless essentially be religious beliefs. A scientific belief that's held to dogmatically would nevertheless qualify as a religious belief. And a belief about God that was held tentatively, not dogmatically, would qualify as more scientific. And that's quite an interesting consideration, is the plasticity between theological conversations and quote-unquote paradigmatic scientific conversations, and the idea that faith commitment can actually apply to either one. And I'm quite sympathetic with that. In fact, I think it's perfectly true that many people who hold to a certain opinion about climatology actually profess a religion. They don't admit it, but they adhere to it dogmatically. They treat dissenters as heretics. They have an entire, almost hymnology that they have. It's quite striking. It's very religious. And ultimately, I'm going to end here with a quote from Francis Bacon. I've talked about Bacon in other projects, and I'm not, again, endorsing Bacon as a person, whatever that might mean, but I'm simply repeating something he said that I think has some wisdom to it, and that is his oft-quoted line that a little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy brings the mind around to religion.